everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Samantha Politics. I'm really excited to be joined here by two amazing guests today, who we will get to a little bit later on in the program. So I want to start out with talking about a couple of things that have happened in the world, and then we're going to get to the main gist of our program, which is going to be about the conflict happening in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. But first, some world news that I wanted to share with you. So one thing I just wanted to reflect on is that the COVID vaccine, a lot of people in the US are now getting the COVID vaccine. I just reflect upon the fact that rich nations are now, they're now giving vaccines at the rate of 1 adult per second, and yet developing countries may not get it for years. There's some countries that haven't gotten a single dose. So just to recognize, if you are one of those lucky people that have gotten a vaccine, how grateful you really should be for it, because it's not a given to be able to get that kind of vaccination. There's a report that gender equity has been pushed back 36 years by the pandemic, as if the World Economic Forum's report that we were like 218 years away wasn't far enough. Now we're back another 36. So I think there's going to be a lot of progress that we need to redo on gender equality, that we need to look at as we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly with regards to caretaking. We also have some breaking news today from Brazil. So Zach, if you could put up that photo of Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil decided to sack his defense minister, General Fernando Azevedo e Silva. And that was not looked well upon by the rest of the country, because the head of the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy promptly quit. Can you imagine if the head of the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy quit when Mattis left, or I don't even know how many defense secretaries we had in the Trump administration left, how destabilizing that would be to the government. So right now there's a lot of people looking out to say what's going to happen in Brazil. There's also people calling for the impeachment of Bolsonaro, because they think that the reason that he got rid of the defense minister was because the defense minister said that the armed forces loyalty should be about upholding the Constitution and not about supporting the president personally. Sound like someone else Trump. Trump. I apologize. The anchor for the 9 o'clock news, Ellie, is in the background. She's getting a little feisty. So some people are thinking that the reason, so a lot of people are deciding that they want to impeach Bolsonaro now for his handling also of the coronavirus crisis. Now, Brazil is only second. It is the second worst country in the world in terms of number of cases and number of deaths, after, guess which country? I'll give you one guess. America, the beautiful, for gracious skies of gray. Yeah, Brazil has done almost as bad as America when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic. And just like Trump, you had Bolsonaro doing things like telling Brazilians to stop whining, who were complaining about the COVID-19 pandemic, not enforcing really any sort of restrictions, not being really proactive with regards to putting down safeguards for the COVID-19 pandemic, or really doing much of anything in terms of helping his country to respond to this. A lot of people are still sick there. A lot of people are dying. And unlike the US, only 8% of the population has been vaccinated. So, we've covered a lot of nascent democracies on this show, and I think it's just really important to remember one of the reasons that I think that the Capitol, did not fall is because our democracy is reasonably old. It's, what are we, 1776, 1879, 200 and something years old, 250 years old. I probably got that number wrong. Math's not my strong suit. But thinking about, so Brazil only emerged from a military dictatorship in 1985. So looking at Brazil, looking at countries that came out in democracy in 1991, these are just much more nascent democracies. And the infrastructure is not necessarily as strong as it is in the US and other established democracies, which means that when something like this happens, there is more of a risk of a military coup. And I think a lot of people in Brazil are worrying that there may, in fact, be a military coup. So let's watch Brazil. Okay. Moving all the way across the world to another continent, which is Italy. So I want you to just take a deep breath, because this story blew my mind when I first heard it reported on the BBC. It is wild. Okay, so imagine that you're a woman and you had an abortion. And next thing that happens, you want to move on with your life. Not a pleasant experience. You kind of want to just forget that it happened and move on. In Italy, they give you the option of having your fetus buried and a religious burial over that. Also, something in the Italian Constitution, or not sure if it's the Italian Constitution or the Catholic Church, says that fetuses can be put into mass graves, but there's not supposed to be any sort of allocation of who that fetus once belonged to. And keep in mind, a fetus, can start as small as that. Well, unbeknownst to hundreds of women in Italy, their fetuses, which sometimes we're, told, okay, maybe it's in a mass grave, or maybe it's not, maybe it's been destroyed. I don't know. I've honestly never even thought about this quandary because I think more about the rights of the woman and her life. But this woman found out that there was a grave with her name on it. Ellie, stop. That there was a grave with her name on it that was attached to her fetus that had been taken out during her abortion. That in this cemetery, it's in Roma, the Flaminio Cemetery, there is this huge lot that is all with white crosses, and they all bear the names of these women's fetuses. Now, this is like a total violation of privacy, of basically like, hey, check out the woman who had an abortion. Plus, all of these tombs were given religious burials, even though many of the women are not Catholic, or they didn't want a religious burial, or they think this is total malarkey. So this has prompted like a freaking firestorm in Italy of women. It's kind of like Me Too 2.0. This is really seen as a women's rights violation in Italy, a human rights violation, a privacy rights violation that, the Catholic Church would take it upon themselves, it seems like in some sort of cooperation with the Italian government, to put these fetuses like on display with these crosses, with these women's names attached to them without any permission of the women. It is so egregious that it made me sick to my stomach when I heard about this. So look this story up further. It is wild. And it's a little bit scary that you believe in hospital staff that they say, oh, it's going to be destroyed, or maybe you don't even care. And all of a sudden it's ending up in some graveyard in Rome, which, Rome is a big city. It's not like on some hilltop in the middle of nowhere with your name attached to it. I mean, that is staggering. So I really wanted to cover that story because it's so big with regards to women's rights. It's incredibly important story. And it shows how much sometimes women are violated when they don't even realize it. So let's move across the world again. And this time, and Zach, sorry, I didn't tell you to show that slideshow of the crosses in Italy, but I'm assuming you did. And we're going to move across the world again to Africa. I kind of love this. We've covered Latin America, Europe, and now we're moving to Africa. So the new president of Tanzania is a woman, which is really exciting. The former president died, and she has now taken his shoes for the rest of his term, Samia Suluhu Hassan. So we're going to get to her when we have Ambassador Courville on the show. I'm going to ask her what she thinks of Miss Hassan. But now, as I take a breath, let us move on to the main content of the show. So I first heard about the Tigray conflict in tweets to Biden as he was assuming office. And I was like, I haven't even really heard anything going on in Africa, and I'm usually reading the news. What is going on here? So I really wanted to look deeply at this and dive deep. And it really did get covered up in the news cycle because a lot of these things that have been happening in Ethiopia came to a head right around the time of the United States elections in the beginning of November. So basically what happened, and Zach, you can bring up that map of Ethiopia. So first of all, you can see where Ethiopia is on the map. the northeast of the country. And then Zach, you can bring up that second map, and you can see that the Tigray region is at the top of Ethiopia, and it borders Eritrea. And that is important because Eritrea has gotten involved in this conflict as well. And I think it has to do with the proximity to the Tigray region and how easy it is for Eritrean forces to come across the border. Ali, stop. So I want to give you a brief rundown of what has happened before we bring in our first guest. So basically what happened is the Tigray people, they make up 6% of Ethiopia, but they were the major party in the ruling coalition in Ethiopia for a really long time. In 2018, the new Prime Minister Abiy was not part of that party. And he came up in 2018, and it was a new recalibration of power. And the Tigrayan people did not see legitimacy within his government. Now, in spring of 2020, and I think I'm pronouncing his name wrong, but Prime Minister Abiy postponed the national elections, quoting the coronavirus pandemic. But as some of constitutional scholars may know, in times of war, in times of emergency, that's always a really fun time to postpone things and be like, oh, just kidding, no elections. Oh, democracy, that was fun. But it's a war. We can't have democracy right now. We have our national security to protect. So postpone the national elections, but the government's mandate expired in October, and this was of 2020. So the Tigray People's Liberation Front organized a regional election, even though the federal government said we're not having elections right now. Abiy dismissed the results of that and stopped giving money to Tigray. And then on October 29th, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which is short for TPLF, refused to accept the government's appointees and basically said they were going to block all of the government forces in Tigray. They then attacked the EDNF Northern Command headquarters, claiming preemptive self-defense. What happened then? The prime minister then reacted. He ordered federal troops into Tigray, and basically said, TPLF, you're not in charge anymore, hand over control. And then it gets really bad. And I'm not going to lie, if you are disturbed by things that are very violent and brutal, this is really hard stuff to read. It's hard to report on, and it's got to be about 9 billion times harder to be there. So within this conflict, there's also been Abiy saying he's, the usual attacking terrorists, and this is law enforcement, but there's reports of indiscriminate shelling of civilian areas. And there's also been reports of actually mass murders of civilians. For example, Amnesty International actually verified through satellite imagery and photos that 600 people were stabbed and or hacked and or strangled to death in Maikadera on November 9th. They were not people that were fighting any sort of liberation front or any sort of army. These were civilians. Just being attacked and murdered in cold blood. There's been other reports of this happening in other towns, mass murder of civilians. The other thing that's really interesting is the involvement of the Eritrean troops, because they've also been cited for looting and killing, and there's also been a mass amount of sexual violence. We also have a major humanitarian crisis now happening. More than 60,000 people have sought refuge in neighboring Sudan. At least 2 million people have been displaced internally, which includes 25,000, the irony of 25,000 Eritrean refugees that were refugees within Ethiopia, and their camps were destroyed, and nobody even knows where they are. So 25,000 people, their camps were totally destroyed. And 1.3 million people, that's probably a low number, are in desperate need of aid. The other reason that I didn't really know about what was happening, a lot of people didn't, is that there was an internet blackout almost immediately. No cell phones, no internet, no Facebook, no WhatsApp. So in terms of being able to access information, it's been really hard to get that information, which is why places like Amnesty International had to use satellite imagery and photos from refugees and accounts from refugees to be able to try to piece all of this together, because the UN has only just recently got access to some very small pockets just to provide humanitarian aid. It's even risky for humanitarian workers. Doctors Without Borders facilities have been attacked and looted. Healthcare facilities have been attacked. There's been reports of shooting at UN personnel. Like, nobody is off bounds for this, even aid providers, who are usually not immune from conflict, but they're supposed to be, they're not partisan actors. You're not supposed to shoot at them. Okay. Whew. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an understanding of the conflict. It is complicated, but has now evolved into, it's not only, in Ethiopia, it's now has implications for Sudan, for Eritrea. So our first guest I want to introduce is Merhawit Girmay. I think I screwed it up again. Merhawit Girmay. And she works for a non-for-profit academic research organization that works on breast and colon cancer and colorectal cancer. But she's here with her capacity as a member of Tigray, a nonprofit, nonpartisan global organization advocating for human rights and economic development of Tigrayans and other oppressed people in Tigray. She has her master's degree in public health from the University of Minnesota. So without further ado, and then I'm going to bring in Ambassador Courville a little bit later on in the episode. Without further ado, I'm going to bring you on, Merhawit. I can do this. Okay. Hi, welcome to Samantha Politics.
Thank you, Samantha, for inviting me to give a bit of overview, as well as to talk about what's, just in a broad sense, what's going on in Tigray. I really appreciate this platform, and it's an opportunity to bring awareness of the genocide that is occurring.
So give us just a rundown on you first. Mm-hmm. Are you Ethiopian, or is your family Ethiopian? What's your relationship to the conflict?
Sure. So I am of Tigrayan descent, and actually a lot of Tigrayans don't feel or call themselves Ethiopian, just given the way that the country has attacked Tigrayans, not TPLF, but the civilians themselves. So I am of Tigrayan descent. I was actually born in Sudan, where a lot of Tigrayans in the early 90s and late 80s fled from Tigray to Sudan because of the civil war that was there, that was occurring by the previous administration, the Derg. And so it looks like history is repeating itself, as many Tigrayan civilians are fleeing to Sudan, over 60,000 currently, in order to survive. And so that is my connection to Tigray. I still have, as many of the Tigrayan people that I know have family members still in Tigray whom we haven't heard back from. We don't know if they are alive or dead. And so it is a very personal situation to us all.
So you're still not able to have any sort of communication with people in the region? Is it still totally blacked out? No ability to find your family?
Well, no, it's not totally blacked out. So there are certain areas such as Mekelle, which is the capital city of Tigray. You are able to call in and out in certain other cities. However, in the more rural areas, many people have not heard from their family, because there's no means of accessing telecommunications.
So what have you heard from, and I know a lot of these reports are coming from refugees that have crossed the border. Mm-hmm. What have you heard in terms of reports of what's going on in the region?
Yeah, gross human rights violations, extrajudicial murders of civilians. Recently, MSF staff, Doctors Without Borders, testified to the Ethiopian army stopping a bus in which Tigrayan civilians were also in, and shooting them to death, and they saw their bodies. The use of rape is rampant, weaponized rape, and there have been countless of stories, safe houses of women who have been held hostage for days, weeks on end, raped, been forced, Eritrean and Ethiopian armies forcing family members to rape their daughters or their mothers. It's quite sickening, and just this threat of HIV, or you either get raped or you die, given an ultimatum. It's quite tragic and horrifying, just these gross acts that are occurring in Tigray. And oftentimes it's in the dark. What we're seeing, or what we're recently hearing in the news, is just but a glimpse of what has been happening since November 4th. And you mentioned how there was a telecommunications blackout, but that was before November 4th, when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed sent the ENDF and the Eritrean army and Amhara militia to Tigray. And it was done during the elections, and I think that was very strategic, so that the world would not know what was going to happen to the civilians in Tigray.
Mm. I think something else important to point out, these mass rape campaigns, there's a lot of reports of women getting pregnant as well.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at sexual violence against women, it can be used actually to kind of spoil a ethnic bloodline.
Mm-hmm.
It's seen as, they're putting their sperm in from this other ethnic group, and therefore they're ruining the bloodline. Creepy stuff.
Mm-hmm. And that's what some of the soldiers have been saying to these poor women whose bodies are being brutalized. They're saying, you're going to have Amharic children, or Amhara children, excuse me, or Eritrean children. Your bloodline will be no more, and just these other threats. And the way that African society, I would say, and especially Tigrayan society, it's a community. And so one way to really hurt the community is with rape, causing shame and disgrace to the woman, as well as their community. And it's just another attempt to hurt and harm the people of Tigray.
Yeah, absolutely. Creating stigma, making the men feel powerless, and also as a form of male bonding. Whenever I hear accounts of, militaries, raping and looting and pillaging, it becomes like an act of male bonding. Like, a lot of these women you hear, they weren't just raped by one man, they were raped by several members of, the army, which is just horrifying. It's just it's just so awful.
Yeah, it really is. One woman was raped by 23 men. And again, we're only hearing the stories from Mekelle or other cities, but in the rural areas, it's even worse where there isn't much coverage, if we can even call it coverage. It's highly, the Ethiopian government has tried very hard to block any news coming out. And so it has been difficult.
Can you do me a favor? And, I've been a little bit confused with the massacre in Maikadra of who were the offenders. It said there were young men from something, but it was unclear who they were affiliated with. What was the impetus there? I mean, it was like up to 600 people at least.
Mm-hmm. So Amnesty International wrote a report regarding mass burials, mass graves in Maikadra, estimating over 600 people being killed, civilians. And the Ethiopian government took that and ran with that and reported that they were Amhara civilians, however, and put the blame at first at TPLF or forces and militias loyal to TPLF. However, accounts from fleeing Tigrayan refugees in Sudan contradict many of the claims that the Ethiopian government has already issued about what was going on. A lot of the victims were Tigrayan, and therefore we have called Amnesty International, as well as the international community, for an independent investigation as to what is the cause. The TPLF has already stated they had no part of that. And so based on the testimonies of the refugees in Sudan, Tigrayans were targeted by Amhara militias such as Fano, who were trying to eradicate the Tigrayans, the ethnic Tigrayans in Maikadra.
Mm. And something we're going to talk about with Ambassador Courville is that, finally, Secretary of State Blinken is now actually calling it ethnic cleansing,
Mm-hmm.
Which is interesting from a U.S. foreign policy perspective. But I want to go back. I'm going to go over that with Ambassador Courville. So What are you worried will happen down the road if this doesn't end?
Well, just the fact that our people will be completely eradicated from Tigray. I mean, the rate of just murder, the rate of fleeing, over 60,000 people, 60,000 Tigrayan refugees in Sudan. If there is no intervention, if there is no international intervention, we are looking at another Rwanda. I mean, we are looking at a Rwanda situation. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of WHO, stated that we will never ever have another Rwanda, and yet we're confronted with one right now in Tigray, where the Ethiopian army, conspiring with the Eritrean army as well as Amhara militia, are trying to ethnically cleanse Tigrayan civilians, contradicting this whole notion that it was a law and order operation only meant to target a few elite TPLF officials. However, based on just eyewitness reports and accounts, it shows that the civilians are the target. And so that is what we are all worried about: our families, our friends, our people being completely wiped out.
Just horrifying. Just horrifying. What do you want? What is Tigray? I was looking at the website that there's 3 buckets of what they really want from the international community. 1 being sanctions, 2 being investigations, and 3 being advocacy. Can we just go kind of to each of those one at a time? So from an investigation standpoint, what is Tigray and the Tigray people? What do they want from the US or from the international community?
We are an advocacy organization that is trying to raise awareness of what is going on in Tigray, as well as to support Tigrayans wherever they are. But currently, the situation in Tigray has caused us to focus on the genocide and making sure that an independent investigation is possible, so that war crimes can be reported and there can be those who committed those war crimes, that they would be held accountable. We are calling for sanctions on Ethiopian exports, coffee, Ethiopian Airlines, defunding them, excuse me. We are calling for Eritrean troops to be removed from Tigray. Recently,
they did just say, didn't the Ethiopian Prime Minister just say that the Eritrean troops will be withdrawn from the region?
He did, but this administration has been known to lie before. Not that long ago, they have been denying the presence of Eritrean troops. However, we have evidence that they have been there since November 4th and beyond. So his word is not very trustworthy, just given his past history with comments regarding this conflict. However, we'd like verified proof that the Eritrean troops are out. There have been various reports of people witnessing Eritrean troops and new forces moving into Tigray, contradicting what the Prime Minister has said. So we would like it to be verified that they are being moved out.
So what about, so we talked about sanctions. What about the next kind of, from an advocacy, we talked about sanctions. We talked about, from an investigation standpoint, what are you thinking about?
We are asking for international actors to investigate different crimes, specifically my cadre, because that has been a contradicting narrative to what the TPLF has stated occurred. They had no part in it. That is what they are stating, as well as the eyewitness accounts and testimonies of the Tigrayan refugees in Sudan. So we are calling for an independent investigation on that crime, along with just various crimes and destruction of property, looting in Tigray, so that those who committed those crimes will be held accountable.
Great, thank you for clearing that. And then the third bucket is advocacy. What are you looking for the U.S. government or the international community to advocate for on behalf of the Tigrayan people?
Well, so in terms of advocacy, we as the Tigrayan diaspora, we are advocating that our elected officials join together and publicly release stronger rebuke of the Ethiopian government with consequences if they do not follow through with a ceasefire, for example, or the removal of Eritrean troops. And so we're calling on our elected officials to put that pressure on the Ethiopian government to essentially to stop this war.
Thank you so much, Merhawit. You know, I'm thinking of your family. I'm thinking of your people that just don't. This just shouldn't be happening anymore in 2021. I mean, it just shouldn't. It's just horrible. So I do want to bring in Ambassador Courville, and then I'm going to bring you back in to have a brief dialogue with her before the end of the show. So we'll see you in a minute. Okay. All right. So that was activist Merhawit Girmay for on behalf of Tigray, which is an advocacy organization on behalf of the Tigrayan people. Really just sad stuff that, again, just you know, it's like never again. And then it's, oh, just kidding again. And then never again. Oh, and just kidding again. And then never again. It just keeps happening. So I want to bring in our frequent commentator, Ambassador Cindy Courville, who you may have remembered from before. She's a trusted strategic policy advisor with over 30 years of experience in national security, international affairs, conflict management, international conflict resolution and management, policy, education, negotiation, mediation, and gender integration. She was the first United States ambassador to the African Union, which is pretty incredible. And Ambassador Courville strengthened U.S. policy positions and strategically implemented policy priorities. She was also a former special assistant and senior director to the president at the National Security Council. I can't even go through all of the places she teaches because it's ridiculous. But she's been the chair of about 1 million different departments. This woman is brilliant. Let's just leave it at brilliant. Instead of reading all of that, she has a PhD and an MA degree from the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. She's currently the CEO of Courville Consultants, LLC. So I'm going to bring in Ambassador Courville. Hi, Cindy. Ambassador Courville. It's a pleasure to see you again.
Samantha, Cindy's fine. Thank you so much. You know, it's always a pleasure to be with you. And Merhawit was, you know, so sobering and, you know, to listen to her story. And it's just so unfortunate that we have to repeat these stories. And it reminded me of Myanmar, and I immediately start seeing the comparison simultaneously between the two situations.
I would actually love that because we've covered Myanmar a fair amount on this show. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that kind of similarity that brings up for you.
Well, what I saw was how two governments, you know, in this space of time under the previous administration, utilized what they saw as a vacuum. The world was not watching. In essence, the United States of America was not watching. And so that the leaders of those countries and their totalitarian, dictatorial approaches to dealing what they saw as a threat to their regime. And usually it's a minority group where they feel a sense of ease to eradicate. And it was, you know, so sobering to hear how rape is used in all war situations, no matter the region, the ethnic group, how violence against women is used as a tool. So both governments have strategically worked in a vacuum, recognized, as they said, no one was coming to rescue. And so I see from the challenge of, a Biden administration, who's brand new, who's still assembling its team, to begin to react. And I have to compliment Secretary Blinken on his quick response to this situation. And even in this short time period, they have what I would see as a seasoned team, national security team, most certainly with Secretary Blinken, The newly appointed senior director for African Affairs, Dana Banks, and the deputy assistant, the acting assistant state ambassador, Robert Frank Godak. So we've got a good team there in place.
Now, what do you think was the significance of Secretary of State Blinken finally coming out and saying to Congress, this is ethnic cleansing, using that terminology? What's the significance there?
So to speak about it in strictly a policy context, I would say that it is not finally coming, because when you're dealing with governments, there are definitions and structures. So even if the US says it's that, the UN and all of these other organizations, the technicalities, how you intervene, how you gain support. And so from the emotional side, I get it. From the policy and governmental side, it is a much more difficult task to define this way.
What about Chris Coons? So Chris Coons was just sent on a diplomatic delegation to speak to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. And, you know, do you have any context for what the dialogue was there, why he specifically was deployed?
One, he has worked very closely with the president. So when the president sends a special envoy out who reports directly to him in this particular case, it sends a real clear signal to the international community that the president is definitely concerned. And the historical relationship, long-term relationship between the senator and the president is very critical. So he sent someone he trusts and who will give him an honest read of the situation on the ground. And for the Ethiopian government and for the Tigrayan people, international community at large, it should be read that this individual has the ear of the president. This is fundamentally important.
From a U.S. Gov perspective, you know, how much of an effect do you think that has if, you know, Senator Coons goes in and says, look, please open up humanitarian corridors, please withdraw troops from Eritrea, please do this, please do that? You know, is there an or else behind it? Is there if you don't do this, we're going to have to be forced to put, you know, what's the stick and carrot situation there?
Well, you're right. Great observation. Stick and carrot. We're working with diplomacy first. That has to be your first tool. And the fact that State Department is out front, that there's a special envoy, again, signals to the world, signals to the African Union in particular, because the home of the African Union is in Addis Ababa. You know, this is a precarious situation for the host country to now have to be evaluated. It sends a signal to the region. Who's going to be, the regional voice? You talked about Tanzania. We have a new president in place. She's going to be tested by this regional conflict. It will be interesting to see what Uganda, Rwanda do. Ethiopia is a major power in the region. It's a U.S. ally. So even with the humanitarian situation in place, the U.S., and this may sound cold, and please don't get me wrong, it's a grave humanitarian situation. There's no question about that. The U.S. will have to, and it has already signaled that they see that this is just a humanitarian situation, disaster. How they proceed, because we are a country of rule of law, there is a process, and the process isn't quick. And so to deploy forces, that's a last result. To have a diplomatic intervention, to probably most likely have an AU, if that is the case. Now, again, this is a dicey situation. Countries have to be willing. Putting boots on the ground is your absolute last resort. And so I was so pleased to hear Merhawit talk about sanctions, to talk about investigation and advocacy. Those are three very strong tools, it will not be fast enough. And I'm going to say that. It will not be fast enough to save as many lives, to protect as many people as we would like it to have. And that just breaks my heart and the world's heart as well. But this is the reality. If we can have dialogue with the parties, if the US and the African Union, the European Union, the UN, these are the countries and organizations that have to come together and to pressure. It is so ironic that this prime minister who has won, a Nobel Peace Prize is in this given situation.
When I was researching this, I was like, wait, I had in mind, like, oh, like Myanmar dictator type person. And then I was like, wait, he won the Nobel Peace Prize? I was like, step back a second, what happened? I mean, that is just, so, what were your opinions of him before this whole thing erupted?
Well, I met him when he came for his tour to Washington at the Ethiopian embassy. And I must admit, I was very optimistic. He's very charismatic. The people seem to embrace him. Here were my concerns, not about him necessarily. Well, yes, young man, level of experience. I was a little bit concerned there. His ability to navigate the composition of the government. And I wasn't sure if he was going to be able to do that. In fact, I was concerned whether he would survive rather than what we're seeing now. So maybe he decided to go on, the offensive by, going after. This is a dangerous precedent we've set. So there is a vie for power. It still concerns me how long he can himself stay in power. And if he can't, what happens to this country? We cannot, as a world, and the US in particular, have Ethiopia implode, to have a full-scale civil war.
Right, that's what I was going to ask next. Like, what happens? What if this just goes whoosh, and totally spirals out of control? What happens to Africa? I mean, what is the effect that has?
For East Africa, this is a really dire situation. You have to think about Al-Qaeda and all kinds of other different groups who are coming into play, who you create a vacuum. You have to think about Egypt because the dam and the control of the water, because not only do you have the issue of an internal conflict or civil war, but you could have a regional conflict over the dam and the water. And that one isn't if it happens, but when it happens, if we cannot negotiate, we, the royal we in this particular case, what happens to a Somalia, an Eritrea? And it's interesting the dynamics that we see in place. So think of when Meles was in power, or as they fought against Mengistu. When you carve up a country based on geographical ethnic lines, personally, I think you're setting yourself up for conflict at some point in time. And to move from a federal system to a centralized political system is just asking, in the simplest terms, for trouble and upheaval. And that transition, which means, and I hope Merhawit will comment on this, you're taking away the power of a region, a state, to govern itself. That means all of the states will lose power, and power will be concentrated in a centralized under the prime minister.
What is the effect of something else I found very interesting was the involvement of Eritrea, how there have been Eritrean forces from the get-go of this conflict helping on the Ethiopian government side. What's the Eritrean incentive for this?
From my perspective, okay, we have the prime minister, who negotiated a peaceful, relationship, an end to conflict. But Isaiah might have other ambitions and issues at stake. So I am truly concerned that this will lead to an escalation of conflict in the region.
I want to bring a light to Merhawit saying, you know, this is another Rwanda. What are your thoughts on that?
That's strong language. So if I put my policy hat on, my diplomatic hat, and it doesn't take away from the validity of what she said, but when you get into the technical definition of the term, and it's hard to put human life into quantification, but we do. What triggers intervention? And as horrific as Rwanda was, who intervened? I have to go back to Tanzania intervening into Uganda under Idi Amin, and it took an African head of state to do that. Mm-hmm. And this is a different dynamic because you have a very strong, actually one of the strongest militaries on the continent. So a president who controls that, I would say this is problematic. It will take time before officially, if it is deemed that a genocide, is labeled. And, you know, from a human standpoint, it is hard to quantify.
Last question before we bring on Merhawit back in is, you know, analysts consider Ethiopia the strategic linchpin of the Horn of Africa. And there's, you know, reporting that Ethiopia could then be a source of instability for neighboring states, that Ethiopia has really been strong. Like, I just found it, I was just reading a book about Sudan and the conflict in South Sudan, and just that, you know, my head was like spinning of like, okay, there are Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia. Sudan was once a place where everyone was fleeing Sudan. Now we have Ethiopian refugees going to Sudan and Eritrean refugees going from Ethiopia to Sudan. Like, what is happening?
Oh, it really is a humanitarian nightmare. And then you add COVID-19 to it.
Right.
So, you know, people who would be lost on multiple levels. So, yes, Ethiopia politically, prior to COVID-19, economically, and most certainly militarily, is an anchor country for the East African region in particular, and the Horn of Africa. So from this case, to have a destabilized Ethiopia can really be the linchpin for destabilizing the whole region. Tanzania doesn't have the military capability to intervene on its own. And do you want to have what we had in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, an intervention? And that did not bode well. So none of these other countries, Chad is destabilized. Central Africa Republic is a failed state. Somalia, in my opinion, is still a failed state. So look at the region. So it leaves Rwanda and Uganda, literally, as the linchpins. Two small countries, but with superior military force. But they don't have the sheer numbers. Not only does Ethiopia have an army, it has a sophisticated air force.
And there's also reports that worries that they may withdraw from other regions like Somalia, which may then harden the resolve of al-Shabaab to then attack more within that region.
So could you imagine this, that Ethiopia has multiple fronts for conflict? And so it is literally sitting in the middle of all of these countries who, as I said, failed states to the west of it, failed states to the east, and then your major power conflict, Egypt to the north of you. And we have to also think of Libya. So they're all, you know, the Sahel. This is, you know, who's going to go in? Why would the U.S. go in? And I say that not sarcastically, because to go in with boots on the ground, I don't see it. I would have to see an African Union peacekeeping, if you can get to the peace. But peace enforcement is a harder group to deploy because it's coalition of the willing. Who pays for it? You know, and which means Western countries primarily would have to pay to support this group. The timeline for deployment, we would say, if let's say all things go right, you could be looking at anywhere from 4 to 6 months before you could get boots on the ground.
Wow. Now, this relates to the next question, which is from our audience on Facebook. We have a question from our guest that says, does Ambassador Courville think that the U.S. will ultimately intervene?
Oh, that's a tough one. I would say diplomacy is going to be first. And I'm going to give you my best guess because this team is dealing with so many things and still a bit understaffed. I'd say that's a last resort, absolute last resort. It would first be to support an African Union mission on the ground. It is the quickest way to do things because we do. Now, the irony is one of our support centers is in Ethiopia. So the materials and resources, when I was there, we started up and my predecessors did an outstanding job of plussing up. We have our surplus equipment and all of those things there in Ethiopia. Would we have access to it? So the country has to agree to accept the forces. And I would think like Myanmar, and I hope that the Prime Minister is not in the same frame of mind, that he truly recognized what is at stake, that he would be open. I'm saying right now, not likely. Not anytime soon.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Courville. I want to bring Merhawit into the conversation, and let's see if we can get a little bit of a dialogue going for the rest of our session, since I think, you know, hi, Merhawit.
Hello.
Do you have anything you wanted to kind of respond to Ambassador Courville?
Yeah, so I think just looking at the situation, I think a lot of us are aware that any boots on the ground are a last resort and most likely unlikely for that to happen, which is why we are calling for international actors to demand a ceasefire to aid in putting more pressure on the Ethiopian government. Eritrea was recently sanctioned. Why was Ethiopia not sanctioned? And in that way, money, putting your mouth where your money is, essentially. And I think that can, just to add to that, Ethiopia is already destabilized. I mean, there's conflict throughout the country, not only in Tigray. Tigray, there's an active ethnic cleansing campaign by the Ethiopian government, along with the Eritrean army. And you asked the question, what is Isaiah's motivation for doing this? I mean, a lot of it is from vengeance and a desire to hurt the TPLF because of the previous administration when Meles was the prime minister. I'm sure you're aware of the war of Badme, and therefore it is a war of vengeance, which is why he is partnering with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and also because of TPLF's refusal to join the centralized system, the Prosperity Party, that the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed began to sideline TPLF and to villainize them, calling them daytime hyenas. So there's a lot of hostility there, and it did not just stay to the TPLF, but to Tigrayan civilians. And then if you look at what's happening in Oromia.
I'm going to stop there, Merhawit, because there's a lot to unpack there. I want to just go to you, Ambassador Courville, on the sanctions bit. You know, what's going on with U.S. sanctions against Ethiopia? What's your opinion there?
No, first thank Merhawit for her comments. With sanctions, again, that's a process with Congress, and we'll have to go through it. I think there is enough support that can be garnered within Congress to support sanctions that will be bipartisan, because there are still senators and representatives who will be supportive of this. Africa, the approach to Africa for the most part, even in the vacuum of the Trump administration, there was still that bipartisan. So I think that's in the favor of the situation in Ethiopia. I think in terms of that, it would be getting our European allies to also come on board, to push for China to come on board. And we're very fortunate to have, Ambassador Thomas Greenfield with all of her experience on Africa at the UN. So that gives me hope for a broader sanction to include UN sanctions. And she has the respect of her colleagues. So I think that could be a plus. So maybe we'll be able to accelerate that process. What does concern me, and Merhawit, we're on the same page, Isaiah, there is nothing good about this dynamic relationship across the board. And where I would put my policy hat on, even though from your perspective, and I concur with you, Ethiopia is unstable, not totally from a US perspective, as a political, economic, and military and intelligence partner. So from a national security standpoint, we cannot afford to have a destabilized Ethiopia, and most certainly from a humanitarian. So I think you're going to see those two fronts, those two issues, probably accelerate. I'm optimistic what is done to engage, to support the people, and to reduce the threat and the tragedy that has taken place, and unfortunately will likely continue until we can do something like that.
I think, what this highlights that's just so interesting, but, alternately infuriating is, that when people are dying on the ground, and people are dying every day, you want quick action, right? It's just, one story of one person is just so horrifying. But, I remember someone saying to me once that the US government moves like a steamship, like a big tanker. And that in order for it to change course, it can't just go whoosh, 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 whoosh. It's like you have to get all of these things in play to be able to shift the ship just a little bit left, of course.
If you're an authoritarian ruler or dictator, you can turn on a dime. But when you're a democracy, a representative democracy, you cannot do that. There are what we call, on the diplomatic side and the military side, rules of engagement. There are indicators and warnings of how we are to proceed. And fortunately for the Biden administration, Biden-Harris administration, they're acting quickly to put policies in place, because we've been in a vacuum for the last 4 years with little or no policy in place. And that is also problematic. And we have so many vacancies at the bottom, mid-level, career level, to people who bring in the expertise. So at the strategic level, I think we're doing fine. It's the other people who make the machinery work.
Pastor Courville, are you looking to serve in this administration? Or are you allowed to tell us that?
My dear, if asked, we'll serve, and otherwise I'm going to continue with life and support from the outside.
It just feels like such a shame not to have you in the government. I'm like, I want you to get in there, figure this out.
I will be honest, I was definitely a Biden campaign supporter and working really hard at the grassroots level. So I am thrilled to have this administration in place. Yeah. But, it's early days, and the fact that they have moved, I know to the rest of the world it seems slow. They have moved swiftly to have an Africa team nearly in place. Department of Defense, I still think the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense position is vacant, and I'll stand corrected if someone else has more accurate news. So we're just missing one key person. But as I said, all the cabinet level people who are key to dealing with Ethiopia and the Tigrayan situation are experienced. So I'm going to be optimistic. I'm going to be hopeful, prayerful, and I hope that our European allies will be right there in lockstep with us, and that they will be able, and others, to leverage China and Russia at the Security Council.
Merhawit, how can people support Tigray and the plight of the Tigrayan people? What can the layperson do? We know what the U.S. government can do, but what can I do? What can my dog do?
Thank you for that question. Right now, we're using social media to raise awareness, calling our representatives, and if you can just go on omnatigray.org, so it's OMNATIGRAY.org, and you will find different ways in which you can help contribute to the Twitter campaign. We have many resources, reports, situational reports, and slide decks that give information to the context of this war, because it is very complicated, given that there are also layers of grievances in the past, as well as many different ethnic tensions involved in what's going on that can give a lot of historical context to people who might not be aware of what's going on.
Thank you so much, Merhawit. So did you hear that? So you can call your congresspeople, you can encourage them to put pressure on the US government about this. You can tweet at Tigray, you can go to their website, just to even raise awareness, just sharing this episode. This is very underreported in the US media. And so just even sharing this episode or other resources so that your peers know that there is a conflict that is threatening to destabilize all of Africa, which will have ripple effects to us. We are not immune, is incredibly important. What about you, Ambassador Courville? What do you think that U.S. people can do to help the situation?
Well, first I want to thank Merhawit for her insight and for being part of an organization and getting that information out. Most certainly, as you said, write to your congressperson to make sure that they know this is a critical issue. There are many other NGOs who can help to leverage that situation. I think this is critical because in this time of COVID, it's so easy to forget that the rest of the world is there and what they're dealing with, and that we don't have the luxury to deal with just one issue and their lives at stake. So I do not want to see another Rwanda. And I think if we put it in that context, for the average American. And we talk about Myanmar because unfortunately, Ethiopia is in the company of Myanmar. North Korea goes unseen. So it's easy for some of these other countries to be seen as strategically important. Ethiopia and the region is strategically important.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Courville. Such a pleasure having you on the show as usual. You've provided such an amazing lens to this, and in terms of our policy priorities and just frankly how the US government works. And I didn't know that, for example, about deploying the African peacekeeping, the approval and people have to pay for it. I mean, I think you've highlighted like these are complex systems, and it has to do with political will, it has to do with money. There's so many players at stake to be able to try to solve these kinds of conflicts.
Oh, the logistics, we haven't even gotten to the logistics. Right. As we talk, think about Darfur. The United States actually airlifted Rwandans on our plane, the first time we've ever done that, into Darfur during the time as peacekeepers. So that takes the political will of an administration and, the willingness to the expense. And so we do have programs that are there and in place. So Africa Command, most certainly we work closely with the UN And I'm so happy that we have re-engaged with the UN. You know, for the average American, I don't know if you know how critical. And to talk about the World Health Organization, to deal with refugees and all of these things. So it will take not only the East Africa region, but the entire continent to be willing to give, you know, resources, both human and monetary, to this situation. And so from that perspective, this is, I mean, to have China deploy peacekeeping forces into Darfur, the US leveraged that. So we have to put pressure on, gentle pressure on everyone to be responsible. So, you know, my heart just goes out. The 2 years I spent in Ethiopia to see this unfold is just devastating. And I can't begin to comprehend what it must be like for the person on the ground. And the closest I can come to that was my time as a political military analyst being on the ground during the war in Angola. I got to leave. It's another thing to have to stay.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful quote to end on. I got to leave, but, you know, others have to stay. You don't necessarily have that, you know, people on the ground, they don't get to leave the conflict when it's, they don't get evacuated because there's a security concern. They're there. So thank you so much to both of you. It's been such a pleasure. Merhawit, thank you for sharing your stories. Again, my heart is with you. And I know many others are also with the Tigrayan people through this, and just hoping that people can recover and find refuge and find safety and be able to live their lives in a, you know, normal way, and be free from violence and fear. That's what I wish for you. But thank you so much for your work.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Courville.
Bye, ladies.
Bye-bye.
See you next time.
Okay.
Whew. Well, that was an incredible episode with Ambassador Cindy Courville, who was the U.S. ambassador to the African Union, the very first one to see her just understanding of where to put pressure and how many different players there are to be able to put pressure on this conflict to end is really, really interesting. And then to have Merhawit, you know, if you didn't know what was going on in the Tigray region in Ethiopia, thank you so much for watching. Just taking your time to learn about this is incredibly important. And I know we all have time sucks, but just to know what's happening on the other side of the world is just so incredibly important. It also means a lot to activists and to people on the ground to know that somebody else cares. I remember when I went to just an event on Syria a long time ago, and this woman was just amazed that I came. It was just like, thank you for caring. I didn't have to say anything. It was just showing up. It just mattered so much that I cared enough to listen and to want to know what was going on. So thank you to Ambassador Courville and to Merhawit. I want to thank Stream Inspectors for the incredible production of this show, all these beautiful graphics, the fancy things swirling around my head in purples and pinks and greens. That's all because of Zach Ward and his amazing team. So I really want to thank them for being sponsors of the show and for being an incredible production team. Thank you, Stream Inspectors. If you liked this show, this reporting that we do, you know, this is not really something that we're making money off of. So if you could like the page on Facebook, subscribe to it on YouTube, that kind of support enables us to get sponsors so we can keep the show going, so we can do more reporting. Also, if you're interested in partnering on a sponsorship, please feel free to reach out to us on our Facebook page and share this episode. Without further ado, I'm Samantha Carlin, your host of Samantha Politics, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.